Part 3, Chapter 7 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 7, Embassy. Inquiring for her at tea-time, Soames learned that Fleur had been out in the car since 2. 3 hours! Where had she gone? Up to London without a word to him? He had never become quite reconciled with cars. He had embraced them in principle, like the born empiricist or Forsyte that he was, adopting each symptom of progress as it came along with, "Well, we couldn't do without them now." But in fact he found them tearing, great, smelly things. Obliged by Annette to have one, a roll-hard with pearl-grey cushions, electric light, little mirrors, trays for the ashes of cigarettes, flower vases, all smelling of petrol and stephanotis, he regarded it much as he had used to regard his brother-in-law, Montague Darty. The thing typified all that was fast, insecure, and subcutaneously oily in modern life. As modern life became faster, looser, younger, Soames was becoming older, slower, tighter, more and more in thought and language like his father James before him. He was almost aware of it in himself. Pace and progress pleased him less and less. There was an ostentation, too, about a car which he considered provocative in the prevailing mood of labour. On one occasion that fellow Sims had driven over the only vested interest of a working man. Soames had not forgotten the behaviour of its master, when not many people would have stopped to put up with it. He had been sorry for the dog, and quite prepared to take its part against the car, if that ruffian hadn't been so outrageous. With 4 hours fast becoming 5, and still no Fleur, all the old car-wise feelings he had experienced in person and by proxy bawled within him, and sinking sensations troubled the pit of his stomach. At 7 he telephoned to Winifred by trunk call. No, Fleur had not been to Green Street. Then where was she? Visions of his beloved daughter rolled up in her pretty frills, all blood and dust-stained in some hideous catastrophe, began to haunt him. He went to her room and spied among her things. She had taken nothing, no dressing-case, no jewellery. And this, a relief in one sense, increased his fears of an accident. Terrible to be helpless when his loved one was missing, especially when he couldn't bear fuss or publicity of any kind. What should he do if she were not back by nightfall? At 7:45 he heard the car. A great weight lifted from off his heart. He hurried down. She was getting out, pale and tired-looking, but nothing wrong. He met her in the hall. "You've frightened me. Where have you been?" "To Robin Hill. I'm sorry, dear. I had to go. I'll tell you afterward." And with a flying kiss she ran upstairs. Soames waited in the drawing-room. To Robin Hill? What did that portend? It was not a subject they could discuss at dinner, consecrated to the susceptibilities of the butler. The agony of nerves Soames had been through, the relief he felt at her safety, softened his power to condemn what she had done, or resist what she was going to do. He waited in a relaxed stupor for her revelation. Life was a queer business. There he was at 65, and no more in command of things than if he had not spent 40 years in building up security. Always something one couldn't get on terms with. In the pocket of his dinner jacket was a letter from Annette. She was coming back in a fortnight. He knew nothing of what she had been doing out there, and he was glad that he did not. Her absence had been a relief. Out of sight was out of mind. And now she was coming back, another worry. And the Boulderby old crone was gone. Demetrius had got it, all because that anonymous letter put it out of his thoughts. He furtively remarked the strained look on his daughter's face, as if she too were gazing at a picture that she couldn't buy. He almost wished the war back. Worries didn't seem then quite so worrying. From the caress in her voice, the look on her face, he became certain that she wanted something from him, uncertain whether it would be wise of him to give it to her. He pushed his savoury away uneaten, and even joined her in a cigarette. After dinner she set the electric piano-player going, and he augured the worst when she sat down on a cushioned footstool at his knee and put her hand on his. "Darling, be nice to me. I had to see John. He wrote to me. He's going to try what he can do with his mother. But I've been thinking, it's really in your hands, father. If you persuade her that it doesn't mean renewing the past in any way, that I shall stay yours and John will stay hers, that you need never see him or her, and she need never see you or me. Only you could persuade her, dear, because only you could promise. One can't promise for other people. Surely it wouldn't be too awkward for you to see her just this once, now that John's father is dead?" "Too awkward?" Soames repeated. "The whole thing's preposterous." "You know," said Fleur, without looking up, "you wouldn't mind seeing her really?" Soames was silent. Her words had expressed a truth too deep for him to admit. She slipped her fingers between his own, hot, slim, eager. They clung there. This child of his would corkscrew her way into a brick wall. "What am I to do if you won't, father?" she said very softly. "I'll do anything for your happiness," said Soames. "But this isn't for your happiness." "Oh, it is, it is." "It'll only stir things up," he said grimly. "But they are stirred up. The thing is to quiet them, to make her feel that this is just our lives and has nothing to do with yours or hers. You can do it, father. I know you can." "You know a great deal, then," was Soames's glum answer. "If you will, John and I will wait a year, 2 years, if you like." "It seems to me," murmured Soames, "that you care nothing about what I feel." Fleur pressed his hand against her cheek. "I do, darling, but you wouldn't like me to be awfully miserable." How she wheedled to get her ends, and trying with all his might to think she really cared for him, he was not sure, not sure. All she cared for was this boy. Why should he help her to get this boy who was killing her affection for himself? Why should he? By the laws of the Forsytes it was foolish. There was nothing to be had out of it, nothing. To give her to that boy, to pass her into the enemy's camp under the influence of the woman who had injured him so deeply. Slowly, inevitably, he would lose this flower of his life, and suddenly he was conscious that his hand was wet. His heart gave a little painful jump. He couldn't bear her to cry. He put his other hand quickly over hers, and a tear dropped on that too. He couldn't go on like this. "Well, well," he said, "I'll think it over and do what I can. Come, come." If she must have it for her happiness, she must. He couldn't refuse to help her. Unless she should begin to thank him, he got out of his chair and went up to the piano-player, making that noise. It ran down as he reached it with a faint buzz. That musical box of his nursery days, the harmonious blacksmith, glorious port. The thing had always made him miserable when his mother set it going on Sunday afternoons. Here it was again, the same thing, only larger, more expensive, and now it played "The Wild Wild Women" and "The Policeman's Holiday," and he was no longer in black velvet with a sky-blue collar. "Performs right," he thought. "There's nothing in it. We're all progressing to the grave." And with that surprising mental comment he walked out. He did not see Fleur again that night, but at breakfast her eyes followed him about with an appeal he could not escape. Not that he intended to try. No, he had made up his mind to the nerve-racking business. He would go to Robin Hill, to that house of memories. Pleasant memory, the last, of going down to keep that boy's father and Irene apart by threatening divorce. He had often thought since that it had clinched their union, and now he was going to clinch the union of that boy with his girl. "I don't know what I've done," he thought, "to have such things thrust on me." He went up by train and down by train, and from the station walked by the long rising lane, still very much as he remembered it over 30 years ago. Funny, so near London. Someone evidently was holding on to the land there. This speculation soothed him, moving between the high hedges slowly, so as not to get overheated, though the day was chill enough. After all was said and done, there was something real about land. It didn't shift. Land, and good pictures. The values might fluctuate a bit, but on the whole they were always going up, worth holding on to, in a world where there was such a lot of unreality, cheap building, changing fashions, such a here today and gone tomorrow spirit. The French were right, perhaps, with their peasant proprietorship, though he had no opinion of the French. One's bit of land, something solid in it. He had heard peasant proprietors described as a pig-headed lot, had heard young Mont call his father a pig-headed morning poster. Disrespectful young devil. Well, there were worse things than being pig-headed or reading the Morning Post. There was Profond and all his tribe, and all these Labour chaps, and loud-mouthed politicians, and wild, wild women. A lot of worse things. And suddenly Soames became conscious of feeling weak and hot and shaky. Sheer nerves at the meeting before him. As Aunt Julie might have said, quoting Superior Dosset, his nerves were in a proper fatigue. He could see the house now among its trees, the house he had watched being built, intending it for himself and this woman who by such strange fate have lived in it with another after all. He began to think of Demetrius, local loans, and other forms of investment. He could not afford to meet her with his nerves all shaking, he who represented the day of judgment for her on earth as it was in heaven, he, legal ownership personified, meeting lawless beauty incarnate. His dignity demanded impassivity during this embassy designed to link their offspring, who, if she had behaved herself, would have been brother and sister. That wretched tune, The Wild, Wild Women, kept running in his head, perversely, for tunes did not run there as a rule. Passing the poplars in front of the house, he thought, "How they've grown! I had them planted." A maid answered his ring. "Would you say Mr. Forsyte, on a very special matter?" If she realized who he was, quite probably she would not see him. By George, he thought, hardening as the tug came, it's a topsy-turvy affair. The maid came back. "Would the gentleman state his business, please?" "Say it concerns Mr. John," said Soames. And once more he was alone in that hall with the pool of grey-white marble designed by her first lover. Ugh! She had been a bad lot, had loved two men, and not himself. He must remember that when he came face to face with her once more. And suddenly he saw her in the opening chink between the long, heavy purple curtains, swaying as if in hesitation. The old perfect poise and line, the old startled dark-eyed gravity, the old calm defensive voice. "Will you come in, please?" He passed through that opening. As in the picture gallery and the confectioner's shop, she seemed to him still beautiful. And this was the first time, the very first, since he married her 37 years ago, that he was speaking to her without the legal right to call her his. She was not wearing black, one of that fellow's radical notions, he supposed. "I apologize for coming," he said glumly, "but this business must be settled one way or the other." "Won't you sit down?" "No, thank you." Anger at his false position, impatience of ceremony between them, mastered him, and words came tumbling out. "It's an infernal mischance. I've done my best to discourage it. I consider my daughter crazy, but I've got into the habit of indulging her. That's why I'm here. I suppose you're fond of your son?" "Devotedly." "Well, it rests with him." He had a sense of being met and baffled, Always, always she had baffled him, even in those old first married days. "It's a mad notion," he said. "It is. If you'd only... well, there might have been..." He did not finish that sentence, brother and sister, and all this saved. But he saw her shudder as if he had, and stung by the sight, he crossed over to the window. Out there the trees had not grown. They couldn't. They were so old. "So far as I am concerned," he said, "you may make your mind easy. I desire to see neither you nor your son, if this marriage comes about. Young people in these days are unaccountable. But I can't bear to see my daughter unhappy. What am I to say to her when I go back?" "Please say to her, as I said to you, that it rests with John." "You don't oppose it?" "With all my heart, not with my lips." Soames stood, biting his finger. "I remember an evening," he said suddenly, and was silent. What was there in this woman that would not fit into the four corners of his hate or condemnation? "Where is he, your son?" "Up in his father's studio, I think." "Perhaps you'd have him down." He watched her ring the bell. He watched the maid come in. "Please tell Mr. John that I want him." "If it rests with him," said Soames hurriedly, when the maid was gone, "I suppose I may take it for granted that this unnatural marriage will take place. In that case there'll be formalities. Whom do I deal with? Herrings?" Irene nodded. "You don't propose to live with them?" Irene shook her head. "What happens to this house?" "It will be as John wishes." "This house," said Soames suddenly, "I had hopes when I began it. If they live in it, their children... They say there's such a thing as Nemesis. Do you believe in it?" "Yes." "Oh, you do." He had come back from the window, and was standing close to her, who in the curve of her grand piano was, as it were, embayed. "I'm not likely to see you again," he said slowly. "Will you shake hands?" His lip quivered. The words came out jerkily. "And let the past die?" He held out his hand. Her pale face grew paler. Her eyes, so dark, rested immovably on his. Her hands remained clasped in front of her. He heard a sound, and turned. That boy was standing in the opening of the curtains. Very queer he looked, hardly recognizable as the young fellow he'd seen in the gallery off Cork Street. Very queer, much older, no youth in the face at all, haggard, rigid, his hair ruffled, his eyes deep in his head. Soames made an effort, and said with a lift of his lip, not quite a smile, nor quite a sneer, "Well, young man, I'm here for my daughter. It rests with you, it seems, this matter. Your mother leaves it in your hands." The boy continued staring at his mother's face, and made no answer. "For my daughter's sake I've brought myself to come," said Soames. "What am I to say to her when I go back?" Still looking at his mother, the boy said quietly, "Tell Fleur that it's no good, please. I must do as my father wished before he died." "John!" "It's all right, mother." In a kind of stupefaction, Soames looked from one to the other. Then, taking up hat and umbrella which he had put down on a chair, he walked towards the curtains. The boy stood aside for him to go by. He passed through and heard the grate of the rings as the curtains were drawn behind him. The sound liberated something in his chest. "So that's that," he thought, and passed out of the front door. End of Part 3, Chapter 7. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 8 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 8, The Dark Tune. As Soames walked away from the house at Robin Hill, the sun broke through the grey of that chill afternoon in smoky radiance. So absorbed in landscape painting that he seldom looked seriously for effects of nature out of doors, he was struck by that moody effulgence. It mourned with a triumph suited to his own feeling. Victory and defeat. His embassy had come to naught. But he was rid of those people, had regained his daughter at the expense of her happiness. What would Fleur say to him? Would she believe he had done his best? And under that sunlight faring on the elms, hazels, hollies of the lane and those unexploited fields, Soames felt dread. She would be terribly upset. He must appeal to her pride. That boy had given her up, declared part and lot with the woman who so long ago had given her father up. Soames clenched his hands. Given him up? And why? What had been wrong with him? And once more he felt the malaise of one who contemplates himself as seen by another, like a dog who chances on his reflection in a mirror, and is intrigued and anxious at the unseizable thing. Not in a hurry to get home, he dined in town at the connoisseur's. While eating a pear, it suddenly occurred to him that, if he had not gone down to Robin Hill, the boy might not have so decided. He remembered the expression on his face while his mother was refusing the hand he had held out. A strange, an awkward thought. Had Fleur cooked her own goose by trying to make too sure? He reached home at 9:30. While the car was passing in at one drive gate, he heard the grinding sputter of a motorcycle passing out by the other. Young Mont, no doubt, so Fleur had not been lonely. But he went in with a sinking heart. In the cream-panelled drawing-room she was sitting, with her elbows on her knees, and her chin on her clasped hands, in front of a white camellia plant which filled the fireplace. That glance at her before she saw him renewed his dread. What was she seeing among those white camellias? "Well, father?" Soames shook his head. His tongue failed him. This was murderous work. He saw her eyes dilate, her lips quivering. "What? Quick, father!" "My dear," said Soames, I did my best, but—" And again he shook his head. Fleur ran to him and put her hand on each of his shoulders. "She?" "No," muttered Soames. "He. I was to tell you that it was no use. He must do what his father wished before he died." He caught her by the waist. "Come, child, don't let them hurt you. They're not worth your little finger." Fleur tore herself from his grasp. "You couldn't have tried. You betrayed me, father." Bitterly wounded, Soames gazed at her passionate figure writhing there in front of him. You didn't try. You didn't. I was a fool. I won't believe he ever could. Only yesterday he— Oh, why did I ask you?" "Yes," said Soames quietly. "Why did you? I swallowed my feelings. I did my best for you against my judgment. And this is my reward. Good night." With every nerve in his body twitching, he went toward the door. Fleur darted after him. "He gives me up? You mean that, father?" Soames turned and forced himself to answer. "Yes." "Oh!" cried Fleur. What could you have done in those old days?" The breathless sense of really monstrous injustice cut the power of speech in Soames's throat. What had he done? What had they done to him? And with quite unconscious dignity he put his hand on his breast and looked at her. "It's a shame!" cried Fleur passionately. Soames went out. He mounted slow and icy to his picture gallery and paced among his treasures. Outrageous! Oh, outrageous! She was spoiled. Ah! And who had spoiled her? He stood still before the Goya copy. accustomed to her own way in everything, flower of his life, and now that she couldn't have it. He turned to the window for some air. Daylight was dying, the moon rising gold behind the poplars. What sound was that? Why, that piano thing, a dark tune with a thrum and a throb. She had set it going. What comfort could she get from that? His eyes caught movement down there beyond the lawn, under the trellis of rambler roses and young acacia trees, where the moonlight fell. There she was, roaming up and down. His heart gave a little sickening jump. What would she do under this blow? How could he tell? What did he know of her? He had only loved her all his life, looked on her as the apple of his eye. He knew nothing, had no notion. There she was, and that dark tune, and the river gleaming in the moonlight. I must go out, he thought. He hastened down to the drawing-room, lighted just as he had left it, with the piano thrumming out that waltz, or foxtrot, or whatever they call it these days, and passed through onto the veranda. Where could he watch without her seeing him? And he stole down through the fruit garden to the boat-house. He was between her and the river now, and his heart felt lighter. She was his daughter, and Annette's. She wouldn't do anything foolish. But there it was. He didn't know. From the boat-house window he could see the last acacia and the spin of her skirt when she turned in her restless march. That tune had run down at last, thank goodness. He crossed the floor and looked through the farther window at the water slow flowing past the lilies. It made little bubbles against them, bright where a moon-streak fell. He remembered suddenly that early morning when he had slept on the houseboat after his father died, and she had just been born, nearly 19 years ago. Even now he recalled the unaccustomed world when he woke up, the strange feeling it had given him. That day the second passion of his life began, for this girl of his roaming under the acacias. What a comfort she had been to him, and all the soreness and sense of outrage left him. If he could make her happy again, he didn't care. An owl flew, queaking, queaking. A bat flitted by. The moonlight brightened and broadened on the water. How long was she going to roam about like this? He went back to the window, and suddenly saw her coming down to the bank. She stood quite close on the landing-stage, and Soames watched, clenching his hands. Should he speak to her? His excitement was intense, the stillness of her figure, its youth, its absorption in despair, in longing, in itself. He would always remember it, moonlit like that, and the faint sweet reek of the river, and the shivering of the willow leaves. She had everything in the world that he could give her, except the one thing that she could not have, because of him. The perversity of things hurt him at that moment, as might a fishbone in his throat. Then, with an infinite relief, he saw her turn back towards the house. What could he give her to make amends? Pearls, travel, horses, other young men, anything she wanted, that he might lose the memory of her young figure lonely by the water. There, she had set that tune going again. Why? It was a mania. Dark, thrumming, faint, travelling from the house. It was as though she had said, "If I can't have something to keep me going, I shall die of this." Soames dimly understood. Well, if it helped her, let her keep it thrumming on all night. And, mousing back through the fruit garden, he regained the veranda. Though he meant to go in and speak to her now, he still hesitated, not knowing what to say, trying hard to recall how it felt to be thwarted in love. He ought to know, ought to remember, and he could not. Gone, all real recollection, except that it had hurt him horribly. In this blankness he stood, passing his handkerchief over hands and lips, which were very dry. By craning his head he could just see Fleur, standing with her back to that piano still grinding out its tune, her arms tight crossed on her breast, a lighted cigarette between her lips, whose smoke half veiled her face. The expression on it was strange to Soames. The eyes shone and stared, and every feature was alive with a sort of wretched scorn and anger. Once or twice he had seen Annette look like that. The face was too vivid, too naked, not his daughter's at that moment. And he dared not go in, realizing the futility of any attempt at consolation. He sat down in the shadow of the ingle-nook. Monstrous trick that fate had played him. Nemesis. That old unhappy marriage. And in God's name, why? How was he to know, when he wanted Irene so violently, and she consented to be his, that she would never love him? The tune died and was renewed, and died again, and still Soames sat in the shadow, waiting for he knew not what. The fag of Fleur's cigarette flung through the window fell on the grass. He watched it glowing, burning itself out. The moon had freed herself above the poplars, and poured her unreality on the garden. Comfortless light, mysterious, withdrawn, like the beauty of that woman who had never loved him, dappling the nemesias and the stocks with a vesture not of earth. Flowers, and his flowers so unhappy. Ah, why could not one put happiness into local loans, gild its edges, insure it against going down? Light had ceased to flow out now from the drawing-room window. All was silent and dark in there. Had she gone up? He rose, and, tiptoeing, peered in. It seemed so. He entered. The veranda kept the moonlight out, and at first he could see nothing but the outlines of furniture blacker than the darkness. He groped towards the farther window to shut it. His foot struck a chair, and he heard a gasp. There she was, curled and crushed into the corner of the sofa. His hand hovered. Did she want his consolation? He stood, gazing at that ball of crushed frills and hair and graceful youth, trying to burrow its way out of sorrow. How leave her there? At last he touched her hair and said, "Come, darling, better go to bed. I'll make it up to you somehow." How fatuous! But what could he have said? End of Part 3, Chapter 8. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 9 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 9. Under the Oak Tree. When their visitor had disappeared, John and his mother stood without speaking, till he said suddenly, "I ought to have seen him out." But Soames was already walking down the drive, and John went upstairs to his father's studio, not trusting himself to go back. The expression on his mother's face confronting the man she had once been married to had sealed a resolution growing within him ever since she left him the night before. It had put the finishing touch of reality. To marry Fleur would be to hit his mother in the face, to betray his dead father. It was no good. John had the least resentful of natures. He bore his parents no grudge in this hour of his distress. For one so young, there was a rather strange power in him of seeing things in some sort of proportion. It was worse for Fleur, worse for his mother even, than it was for him. Harder than to give up was to be given up, or to be the cause of someone you loved giving up for you. He must not, would not, behave grudgingly. While he stood watching the tardy sunlight, he had again that sudden vision of the world which had come to him the night before. Sea on sea, country on country, millions on millions of people, all with their own lives, energies, joys, griefs, and suffering, all with things they had to give up, and separate struggles for existence. Even though he might be willing to give up all else for the one thing he couldn't have, he would be a fool to think his feelings mattered much in so vast a world, and to behave like a cry-baby or a cad. He pictured the people who had nothing, the millions who had given up life in the war, the millions whom the war had left with life and little else, the hungry children he had read of, the shattered men, people in prison, every kind of unfortunate, and they did not help him much. If one had to miss a meal, what comfort in the knowledge that many others had to miss it too. There was more distraction in the thought of getting away out into this vast world of which he knew nothing yet. He could not go on staying here, walled in and sheltered, with everything so slick and comfortable, and nothing to do but brood and think what might have been. He could not go back to Wansdon and the memories of Fleur. If he saw her again, he could not trust himself, and if he stayed here or went back there, he would surely see her. While they were within reach of each other, that must happen. To go far away, and quickly, was the only thing to do. But, however much he loved his mother, he did not want to go away with her. Then, feeling that was brutal, he made up his mind desperately to propose that they should go to Italy. For 2 hours in that melancholy room he tried to master himself, dressed solemnly for dinner. His mother had done the same. They ate little at some length, and talked of his father's catalogue. The show was arranged for October, and beyond clerical detail there was nothing more to do. After dinner she put on a cloak, and they went out, walked a little, talked a little, till they were standing silent at last beneath the oak tree. Ruled by the thought, "If I show anything, I show all," John put his arm through hers and said quite casually, "Mother, let's go to Italy." Irene pressed his arm and said as casually, "It would be very nice, but I've been thinking you ought to see and do more than you would if I were with you." "But then you'd be alone." "I was once alone for more than 12 years. Besides, I should like to be here for the opening of father's show." John's grip tightened round her arm. He was not deceived. "You couldn't stay here all by yourself. It's too big." "Not here, perhaps. In London, and I might go to Paris after the show opens. You ought to have a year at least, John, and see the world." "Yes, I'd like to see the world and rough it, but I don't want to leave you all alone." "My dear, I owe you that at least. If it's for your good, it'll be for mine. Why not start to-morrow? You've got your passport." "Yes, if I'm going, it had better be at once. Only, mother, if I wanted to stay out somewhere, America or anywhere, would you mind coming presently?" "Wherever and whenever you send for me. But don't send until you really want me." John drew a deep breath. "I feel England's choky." They stood a few minutes longer under the oak tree, looking out to where the grandstand at Epsom was veiled in evening. The branches kept the moonlight from them, so that it only fell everywhere else, over the fields and far away, and on the windows of the creeped house behind, which soon would be to let. End of Part 3, Chapter 9. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 10 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 10. Fleur's Wedding. The October paragraphs describing the wedding of Fleur Forsyte to Michael Mont hardly conveyed the symbolic significance of this event. In the union of the great-granddaughter of Superior Dorset with the heir of a 9th baronet was the outward and visible sign of that merger of class in class which buttresses the political stability of a realm. The time had come when the Forsytes might resign their natural resentment against a flummery not theirs by birth, and accept it as the still more natural due of their possessive instincts. Besides, they had to mount to make room for all those so much more newly rich. In that quiet but tasteful ceremony in Hanover Square, and afterward among the furniture in Green Street, it had been impossible for those not in the know to distinguish the Forsyte troop from the Mont contingent. So far away was Superior Dorset now. Was there, in the crease of his trousers, the expression of his moustache, his accent, or the shine on his top hat, a pin to choose between Soames and the 9th Baronet himself? Was not Fleur as self-possessed, quick, glancing, pretty, and hard as the likeliest Muscombe, Mont, or Charwell filly present? If anything, the Forsytes had it in dress and looks and manners. They had become upper class, and now their name would be formally recorded in the stud book, their money joined to land. Whether this was a little late in the day, and those rewards of the possessive instinct, lands, and money destined for the melting pot, was still a question so moot that it was not mooted. After all, Timothy had said consols were going up. Timothy, the last, the missing link. Timothy in extremis on the Bayswater Road, so Francie had reported. It was whispered, too, that this young Mont was a sort of socialist. Strangely wise of him, and in the nature of insurance, considering the days they lived in. There was no uneasiness on that score. The landed classes produced that sort of amiable foolishness at times, turned to safe uses and confined to theory. As George remarked to his sister Francie, "They'll soon be having puppies. That'll give him pause." The church, with white flowers and something blue in the middle of the east window, looked extremely chaste, as though endeavouring to counteract the somewhat lurid phraseology of a service calculated to keep the thoughts of all on puppies. Forsytes, Haymans, Treatymans sat in the left aisle, Monts, Charwells, Muscombes in the right, while a sprinkling of Fleur's fellow-sufferers at school and of Mont's fellow-sufferers in the war gaped indiscriminately from either side, and 3 maiden ladies who dropped in on their way from Skywards brought up the rear, together with 2 Mont retainers and Fleur's old nurse. In the unsettled state of the country, as full a house as could be expected. Mrs. Val Dartie, who sat with her husband in the 3rd row, squeezed his hand more than once during the performance. To her, who knew the plot of this tragi-comedy, its most dramatic moment was well-nigh painful. I wonder if John knows by instinct, she thought. John, out in British Columbia. She had received a letter from him only that morning which had made her smile and say, "John's in British Columbia, Val, because he wants to be in California. He thinks it's too nice there." "Oh," said Val, "so he's beginning to see a joke again." "He's bought some land and sent for his mother." "What on earth will she do out there?" "All she cares about is John. Do you still think it is a happy release?" Val's shrewd eyes narrowed to grey pinpoints between their dark lashes. "Fleur wouldn't have suited him a bit. She's not bred right." "Poor little Fleur," sighed Holly. Ah, it was strange, this marriage. The young man, Mont, had caught her on the rebound, of course, in the reckless mood of one whose ship has just gone down. Such a plunge could not but be, as Val put it, an outside chance. There was little to be told from the back view of her young cousin's veil, and Holly's eyes reviewed the general aspect of this Christian wedding. She, who had made a love match which had been successful, had a horror of unhappy marriages. This might not be one in the end, but it was clearly a toss-up, and to consecrate a toss-up in this fashion with manufactured unction before a crowd of fashionable free thinkers, for who thought otherwise than freely or not at all when they were dolled up, seemed to her as near a sin as one could find in an age which had abolished them. Her eyes wandered from the prelate in his robes, a charwoman, the Forsytes had not as yet produced a prelate, to Val, beside her, thinking, she was certain, of the Mayfly filly at 15-1 for the Cambridgeshire. They passed on and caught the profile of the 9th baronet in counterfeitment of the kneeling process. She could just see the neat ruck above his knees where he had pulled his trousers up, and thought, Val's forgotten to pull up his. Her eyes passed to the pew in front of her, where Winifred's substantial form was gowned with passion, and on again to Soames and Annette kneeling side by side. A little smile came on her lips. Prosper Profond, back from the South Seas of the Channel, would be kneeling too, about 6 rows behind. Yes, this was a funny, small business, however it turned out. Still, it was in a proper church, and would be in the proper papers tomorrow morning. They had begun a hymn. She could hear the 9th baronet across the aisle singing of the hosts of Midian. A little finger touched Val's thumb. They were holding the same hymn-book, and a tiny thrill passed through her, preserved from 20 years ago. He stooped and whispered, "I say, do you remember the rat?" The rat at their wedding in Cape Colony, which had cleaned its whiskers behind the table of the registrars. And between her little and third fingers she squeezed his thumb hard. The hymn was over. The prelate had begun to deliver his discourse. He told them of the dangerous times they lived in, and the awful conduct of the House of Lords in connection with divorce. They were all soldiers, he said, in the trenches under the poisonous gas of the Prince of Darkness, and must be manful. The purpose of marriage was children, not mere sinful happiness. An imp danced in Holly's eyes. Val's eyelashes were meeting. Whatever happened, he must not snore. Her finger and thumb closed on his thigh till he stirred uneasily. The discourse was over, the danger past. They were signing in the vestry, and general relaxation had set in. A voice behind her said, "Will she stay the course?" "Who's that?" she whispered. "Old George Forsyte." Holly demurely scrutinized one of whom she had often heard. Fresh from South Africa, and ignorant of her kith and kin, she never saw one without an almost childish curiosity. He was very big and very dapper. His eyes gave her a funny feeling of having no particular clothes. "They're off," she heard him say. They came, stepping from the chancel. Holly looked first in young Mont's face. His lips and ears were twitching. His eyes, shifting from his feet to the hand within his arm, stared suddenly before them as if to face a firing party. He gave Holly the feeling that he was spiritually intoxicated. But Fleur, that was different. The girl was perfectly composed, prettier than ever in her white robes and veil over her banged dark chestnut hair. Her eyelids hovered demure over her dark hazel eyes. Outwardly she seemed all there, but inwardly where was she? As those two passed, Fleur raised her eyelids. The restless glint of those clear whites remained on Holly's vision, as might the flutter of caged birds' wings. In Green Street Winifred stood to receive, just a little less composed than usual. Soames' request for the use of her house had come on her at a deeply psychological moment. Under the influence of a remark of Prosper Profond, she had begun to exchange her empire for expressionistic furniture. There were the most amusing arrangements, with violet, green, and orange blobs and scriggles, to be had at Melard's. Another month and the change would have been complete. Just now the very intriguing recruits she had enlisted did not march too well with the old guard. It was as if her regiment were half in khaki, half in scarlet and bearskins. But her strong and comfortable character made the best of it in a drawing-room which typified, perhaps more perfectly than she imagined, the semi-Bolshevized imperialism of her country. After all, this was a day of merger, and you couldn't have too much of it. Her eyes travelled indulgently among her guests. Soames had gripped the back of a buhl chair. Young Mont was behind that awfully amusing screen, which no one as yet had been able to explain to her. The ninth baronet had shied violently at a round scarlet table, inlaid under glass with blue Australian butteries wings, and was clinging to her Louis XV cabinet. Francie Forsyte had seized the new mantel-board, finely carved with little purple grotesques on an ebony ground. George, over by the old spinet, was holding a little sky-blue book as if about to enter bets. Prosper Profound was twiddling the knob of the open door, black with peacock-blue panels, and Annette's hands, close by, were grasping her own waist. Two Muscombes clung to the balcony among the plants, as if feeling ill. Lady Mont, thin and brave-looking, had taken up her long-handled glasses, and was gazing at the central light-shade of ivory and orange dashed with deep magenta, as if the heavens had opened. Everybody, in fact, seemed holding on to something. Only Fleur, still in her bridal dress, was detached from all support, flinging her words and glances to left and right. The room was full of the bubble and squeak of conversation. Nobody could hear anything that anybody said, which seemed of little consequence, since no one waited for anything so slow as an answer. Modern conversation seemed to Winifred so different from the days of her prime, when a drawl was all the vogue. Still it was amusing, which was, of course, all that mattered. Even the Forsytes were talking with extreme rapidity, Fleur and Christopher and Imogen and young Nicholas's youngest, Patrick. Soames, of course, was silent, but George, by the spinet, kept up a running commentary, and Francie by her mantel-shelf. Winifred drew nearer to the ninth baronet. He seemed to promise a certain repose. His nose was fine and drooped a little, his grey moustaches too, and she said, drawling through her smile, "It's rather nice, isn't it?" His reply shot out of his smile like a snipped bread pellet. "Do you remember in Fraser the tribe that buries the bride up to the waist?" He spoke as fast as anybody. He had dark, lively little eyes, too, all crinkled round like a Catholic priest's. Winifred felt suddenly he might say things she would regret. "They're always so amusing, weddings," she murmured, and moved on to Soames. He was curiously still, and Winifred saw at once what was dictating his immobility. To his right was George Forsyte, to his left Annette and Prosper Profound. He could not move without either seeing those two together, or the reflection of them in George Forsyte's japing eyes. He was quite right not to be taking notice. "They say Timothy's sinking," he said glumly. "Where will you put him, Soames?" "Highgate." He counted on his fingers. "It'll make 12 of them there, including wives. How do you think Fleur looks?" "Remarkably well." Soames nodded. He had never seen her look prettier, yet he could not rid himself of the impression that this business was unnatural, remembering still that crushed figure burrowing into the corner of the sofa. From that night to this day he had received from her no confidences. He knew from his chauffeur that she had made one more attempt on Robin Hill and drawn blank. An empty house, no one at home. He knew that she had received a letter, but not what was in it, except that it had made her hide herself and cry. He had remarked that she looked at him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't noticing, as if she were wondering still what he had done, forsooth, to make these people hate him so. Well, there it was. Annette had come back, and things had worn on through the summer, very miserable, till suddenly Fleur had said she was going to marry young Mont. She had shown him a little more affection when she told him that, and he had yielded. What was the good of opposing it? God knew that he had never wished to thwart her in anything, and the young man seemed quite delirious about her. No doubt she was in a reckless mood, and she was young, absurdly young, but if he opposed her, he didn't know what she would do, For all he could tell, she might want to take up a profession, become a doctor or solicitor or some such nonsense. She had no aptitude for painting, writing, music, in his view the legitimate occupations of unmarried women, if they must do something in these days. On the whole, she was safer married, for he could see too well how feverish and restless she was at home. Annette, too, had been in favour of it. Annette, from behind the veil of his refusal to know what she was about, if she was about anything. Annette had said, "Let her marry this young man. He's a nice boy, not so highty-flighty as he seems." Where she got her expressions he didn't know, but her opinion soothed his doubts. His wife, whatever her conduct, had clear eyes and an almost depressing amount of common sense. He had settled 50,000 on Fleur, taking care that there was no cross-settlement in case it didn't turn out well. Could it turn out well? She had not got over that other boy. He knew. They were to go to Spain for the honeymoon. He would be even lonelier when she was gone. But later, perhaps, she would forget and turn to him again. Winifred's voice broke on his reverie. "Why, of all wonders, June! There, in the jibbah. What things she wore, with her hair straying from under a fillet. Soames saw his cousin, and Fleur going forward to greet her. The two passed from their view out onto the stairway. "Really," said Winifred, "she does the most impossible things. Fancy her coming!" "What made you ask her?" muttered Soames. "Because I thought she wouldn't accept, of course." Winifred had forgotten that behind conduct lies the main trend of character, or in other words, omitted to remember that Fleur was now a lame duck. On receiving her invitation, June had first thought, "I wouldn't go near them for the world," and then one morning had awakened from a dream of Fleur waving to her from a boat with a wild, unhappy gesture, and she had changed her mind. When Fleur came forward and said to her, "Do come up while I'm changing my dress," she followed up the stairs. The girl led the way into Imogen's old bedroom, set ready for her toilet. June sat down on the bed, thin and upright, like a little spirit in the sere and yellow. Fleur locked the door. The girl stood before her, divested of her wedding dress. What a pretty thing she was! "I suppose you think me a fool," she said, with quivering lips, "when it was to have been John. But what does it matter? Michael wants me, and I don't care. It'll get me away from home." Diving her hand into the frills on her breast, she brought out a letter. "John wrote me this." June read, "Lake Okanagan, British Columbia. I'm not coming back to England. Bless you always, John." "She's made safe, you see," said Fleur. June handed back the letter. "That's not fair to Irene," she said. "She always told John he could do as he wished." Fleur smiled bitterly. "Tell me, didn't she spoil your life too?" June looked up. "Nobody can spoil a life, my dear. That's nonsense. Things happen, but we bob up." With a sort of terror she saw the girl sink on her knees and bury her face in the jibbah. A strangled sob mounted to June's ears. "It's all right," she murmured. "Don't. There." But the point of the girl's chin was pressed ever closer into her thigh, and the sound was dreadful of her sobbing. Well, it had to come. She would feel better afterward. June stroked the short hair of that shapely head, and all the scattered mother sense in her focused itself and passed through the tips of her fingers into the girl's brain. "Don't sit down under it, my dear," she said at last. "We can't control life, but we can fight it. Make the best of things. I've had to. I held on, like you, and I cried, as you're crying now. And look at me." Fleur raised her head. A sob merged suddenly into a little choked laugh. In truth, it was a thin and rather wild and wasted spirit she was looking at, but it had brave eyes. "All right," she said. "I'm sorry. I shall forget him, I suppose, if I fly fast and far enough." And, scrambling to her feet, she went over to the washstand. June watched her removing with cold water the traces of emotion. Save for a little becoming pinkness, there was nothing left when she stood before the mirror. June got off the bed and took a pin-cushion in her hand. To put 2 pins into the wrong places was all the vent she found for sympathy. "Give me a kiss," she said, when Fleur was ready, and dug her chin into the girl's warm cheek. "I want a whiff," said Fleur. "Don't wait." June left her, sitting on the bed with a cigarette between her lips and her eyes half closed, and went downstairs. In the doorway of the drawing-room stood Soames, as if unquiet at his daughter's tardiness. June tossed her head and passed down on to the half-landing. Her cousin Francie was standing there. "Look," said June, pointing with her chin at Soames. "That man's fatal." "How do you mean?" said Francie. "Fatal?" June did not answer her. "I shan't wait to see them off," she said. "Good-bye." "Good-bye," said Francie, and her eyes of a Celtic grey goggled. That old feud! Really, it was quite romantic. Soames, moving to the well of the staircase, saw June go, and drew a breath of satisfaction. Why didn't Fleur come? They would miss their train. That train would bear her away from him. Yet he could not help fidgeting at the thought that they would lose it. And then she did come, running down in her tan-coloured frock and black velvet cap, and passed him into the drawing-room. He saw her kiss her mother, her aunt, Val's wife, Imogen, and then come forth, quick and pretty as ever. How would she treat him at this last moment of her girlhood? He couldn't hope for much. Her lips pressed the middle of his cheek. "Daddy," she said, and was past and gone. Daddy! She hadn't called him that for years. He drew a long breath and followed slowly down. There was all the folly with that confetti stuff and the rest of it to go through with yet. But he would like just to catch her smile if she leaned out, though they would hit her in the eye with the shoe if they didn't take care. Young Mont's voice said fervently in his ear, "Good-bye, sir, and thank you. I'm so fearfully bucked." "Good-bye," he said. "Don't miss your train." He stood on the bottom step but 3, whence he could see above the heads of the silly hats and heads. They were in the car now, and there was that stuff showering, and there went the shoe. A flood of something welled up in Soames, and he didn't know. He couldn't see. End of Part 3, Chapter 10. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 3, Chapter 11 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 11, The Last of the Old Forsytes. When they came to prepare that terrific symbol, Timothy Forsyte, the one pure individualist left, the only man who hadn't heard of the Great War, they found him wonderful. Not even death had undermined his soundness. To Smither and Cook that preparation came like final evidence of what they had never believed possible, the end of the old Forsyte family on earth. Poor Mr. Timothy must now take a harp and sing in the company of Miss Forsyte, Mrs. Julia, Miss Hester, with Mr. Jolyon, Mr. Swithin, Mr. James, Mr. Roger, and Mr. Nicholas of the party. Whether Mrs. Hayman would be there was more doubtful, seeing that she had been cremated. Secretly, Cook thought that Mr. Timothy would be upset. He'd always been so set against barrel organs. How many times had she not said, "Drat the thing, there it is again! Smither, you'd better run up and see what you can do." And in her heart she would have so enjoyed the tunes, if she hadn't known that Mr. Timothy would ring the bell in a minute and say, "Here, take him a halfpenny and tell him to move on." Often they had been obliged to add threepence of their own before the man would go. Timothy had ever underrated the value of emotion. Luckily he had taken the organs for blue bottles in his last years, which had been a comfort, and they had been able to enjoy the tunes. But a harp, Cook wondered. It was a change, and Mr. Timothy had never liked change. But she did not speak of this to Smither, who did so take a line of her own in regard to heaven that it quite put one about sometimes. She cried while Timothy was being prepared, and they all had sherry afterward out of the yearly Christmas bottle, which would not be needed now. Ah dear, she'd been there 45 years, and Smither 43, and now they would be going to a tiny house in Tooting to live on their savings and what Miss Hester had so kindly left them. For to take fresh service after the glorious past, no. But they would just like to see Mr. Soames again, and Mrs. Darty, and Miss Francie, and Miss Euphemia, and even if they had to take their own cab, they felt they must go to the funeral. For 6 years Mr. Timothy had been their baby, getting younger and younger every day, till at last he had been too young to live. They spent the regulation hours of waiting in polishing and dusting, in catching the one mouse left, and asphyxiating the last beetle, so as to leave it nice, discussing with each other what they would buy at the sale. Miss Anne's work-box, Miss Julie's, that is Mrs. Julia's, seaweed album, the fire-screen Miss Hester had crewelled, and Mr. Timothy's hair, little golden curls glued into a black frame. Oh, they must have those. Only the price of things had gone up so. It fell to Soames to issue invitations for the funeral. He had them drawn up by Gradman in his office. Only blood relations, and no flowers. 6 carriages were ordered. The will would be read afterward at the house. He arrived at 11 o'clock to see that all was ready. At 15:15 old Gradman came in black gloves and crape on his hat. He and Soames stood in the drawing-room waiting. At 11:30 the carriages drew up in a long row, but no one else appeared. Gradman said, "It surprises me, Mr. Soames. I posted them myself." "I don't know," said Soames. "He'd lost touch with the family." Soames had often noticed in old days how much more neighbourly his family were to the dead than to the living. But now the way they had flocked to Fleur's wedding and abstained from Timothy's funeral seemed to show some vital change. There might of course be another reason, for Soames felt that if he had not known the contents of Timothy's will, he might have stayed away himself through delicacy. Timothy had left a lot of money, with nobody in particular to leave it to. They mightn't like to seem to expect something. At 12 o'clock the procession left the door, Timothy alone in the first carriage under glass. Then Soames alone, then Gradman alone, then Cook and Smither together. They started at a walk, but were soon trotting under a bright sky. At the entrance to Highgate Cemetery they were delayed by service in the chapel. Soames would have liked to stay outside in the sunshine. He didn't believe a word of it. On the other hand, it was a form of insurance which could not safely be neglected, in case there might be something in it after all. They walked up 2 and 2, he and Gradman, Cook and Smither, to the family vault. It was not very distinguished for the funeral of the last old Forsyte. He took Gradman into his carriage on the way back to the Bayswater Road, with a certain glow in his heart. He had a surprise in pickle for the old chap who had served the Forsytes 54 years, a treat that was entirely his doing. How well he remembered saying to Timothy the day after Aunt Hester's funeral, "Well, Uncle Timothy, there's Gradman. He's taken a lot of trouble for the family. What do you say to leaving him 5,000? And his surprise seeing the difficulty there had been in getting Timothy to leave anything, when Timothy had nodded. And now the old chap would be as pleased as Punch, for Mrs. Gradman, he knew, had a weak heart, and their son had lost a leg in the war. It was extraordinarily gratifying to Soames to have left him £5,000 of Timothy's money. They sat down together in the little drawing-room, whose walls, like a vision of heaven, were sky-blue and gold, with every picture-frame unnaturally bright, and every speck of dust removed from every piece of furniture, to read that little masterpiece, The Will of Timothy. With his back to the light in Aunt Hester's chair, Soames faced Gradman with his face to the light on Aunt Anne's sofa, and crossing his legs, began, "This is the last will and testament of me, Timothy Forsyte, of the Bower, Bayswater Road, London. I appoint my nephews Soames Forsyte, of the Shelter, Mapledurham, and Thomas Gradman, of 159 Folly Road, Highgate, hereinafter called my trustees, to be the trustees and executors of this my will. To the said Soames Forsyte I leave the sum of £1,000 free of legacy duty, and to the said Thomas Gradman I leave the sum of £5,000 free of legacy duty." Soames paused. Old Gradman was leaning forward, convulsively gripping a stout black knee with each of his thick hands. His mouth had fallen open, so that the gold fillings of 3 teeth gleamed. His eyes were blinking. 2 tears rolled slowly out of them. Soames read hastily on. "All the rest of my property, of whatsoever description, I bequeath to my trustees upon trust, to convert and hold the same upon the following trusts, namely, to pay thereout all my debts, funeral expenses, and outgoings of any kind in connection with my will, and to hold the residue thereof in trust for that male lineal descent of my father Jolyon Forsyte by his marriage with Anne Pierce, who, after the decease of all lineal descendants, whether male or female, of my said father by his said marriage, in being at the time of my death, shall last attain the age of 21 years absolutely, it being my desire that my property shall be nursed to the extreme limit permitted by the laws of England, for the benefit of such male lineal descent as aforesaid." Soames read the investment and attestation clauses, and, ceasing, looked at Gradman. The old fellow was wiping his brow with a large handkerchief, whose brilliant colour supplied a sudden festive tinge to the proceedings. "My word, Mr. Soames," he said, and it was clear that the lawyer in him had utterly wiped out the man. "My word! Why, there are 2 babies now, and some quite young children. If one of them lives to be 80, it's not a great age, and add 21, that's 100 years. And Mr. Timothy worth £150,000 net if he's worth a penny. Compound interest at 5% doubles you in 14 years. In 14 years, 300,000, 600,000 in 28, 1,200,000 in 42, 2,400,000 in 56, 4,800,000 in 70, 9,600,000 in 84. Why, in 100 years it'll be 20 million, and we shan't live to use it. It is a will." Soames said dryly, "Anything may happen. The State might take the lot. They're capable of anything in these days." "And carry 5, said Gradman to himself. "I forgot. Mr. Timothy's in consols. We shall get more than 2% with this income tax. To be on the safe side, say 8 millions. Still, that's a pretty penny." Soames rose and handed him the will. "You're going into the city. Take care of that, and do what's necessary. Advertise. But there are no debts. When's the sale?" "Tuesday week," said Gradman. "Life or lives in being, and 21 years afterward. It's a long way off. But I'm glad he's left it in the family." The sale, not at Jobson's in view of the Victorian nature of the effects, was far more freely attended than the funeral, though not by cook and smither, for Soames had taken it on himself to give them their heart's desires. Winifred was present, Euphemia and Francie, and Eustace had come in his car. The miniatures, Barbizons, and J.R. drawings had been bought in by Soames, and relics of no marketable value were set aside in an off-room for members of the family who cared to have mementos. These were the only restrictions upon bidding, characterized by an almost tragic languor. Not one piece of furniture, no picture or porcelain figure appealed to modern taste. The hummingbirds had fallen like autumn leaves when taken from where they had not hummed for 60 years. It was painful to Soames to see the chairs his aunts had sat on, the little grand piano they had practically never played, the books whose outsides they had gazed at, the china they had dusted, the curtains they had drawn, the hearthrug which had warmed their feet, above all, the beds they had lain and died in, sold to little dealers and the housewives of Fulham. And yet what could one do? Buy them and stick them in a lumber room? No, they had to go the way of all flesh and furniture, and be worn out. But when they put up Aunt Anne's sofa and were going to knock it down for 30 shillings, he cried out suddenly, £5! The sensation was considerable, and the sofa his. When that little sale was over in the fusty sale-room, and those Victorian ashes scattered, he went out into the misty October sunshine, feeling as if cosiness had died out of the world, and the board "To Let" was up indeed. Revolutions on the horizon, Fleur in Spain, no comfort in Annette, no Timothy's on the Bayswater Road. In the irritable desolation of his soul he went into the Gunnepenor gallery. That chap Jolyon's watercolours were on view there. He went in to look down his nose at them. It might give him some faint satisfaction. The news had trickled through from June to Val's wife, from her to Val, from Val to his mother, from her to Soames, that the house, the fatal house at Robin Hill, was for sale, and Irene going to join her boy out in British Columbia or some such place. For one wild moment the thought had come to Soames, "Why shouldn't I buy it back? I meant it for mine." No sooner come than gone. Too lugubrious a triumph, with too many humiliating memories for himself and Fleur. She would never live there after what had happened. No, the place must go its way to some peer or profiteer. It had been a bone of contention from the first, the shell of the feud, and with the woman gone, it was an empty shell. For sale or to let? With his mind's eye he could see that board raised high above the ivied wall which he had built. He passed through the first of the 2 rooms in the gallery. There was certainly a body of work. And now that the fellow was dead, it did not seem so trivial. The drawings were pleasing enough, with quite a sense of atmosphere, and something individual in the brushwork. His father and my father, he and I, his child and mine, thought Soames. So it had gone on, and all about that woman. Softened by the events of the past week, affected by the melancholy beauty of the autumn day, Soames came nearer than he'd ever been to realization of that truth, passing the understanding of a Forsyte pure, that the body of beauty has a spiritual essence, uncapturable save by a devotion which thinks not of self. After all, he was near that truth in his devotion to his daughter. Perhaps that made him understand a little how he had missed the prize. And there, among the drawings of his kinsman, who had attained to that which he had found beyond his reach, he thought of him and her with a tolerance which surprised him. But he did not buy a drawing. Just as he passed the seat of custom on his return to the outer air, he met with a contingency which had not been entirely absent from his mind when he went into the gallery. Irene herself coming in. So she had not gone yet, and was still paying farewell visits to that fellow's remains. He subdued the little involuntary leap of his subconsciousness, the mechanical reaction of his senses to the charm of this once-owned woman, and passed her with averted eyes. But when he had gone by, he could not for the life of him help looking back. This, then, was finality. The heat and stress of his life, the madness and the longing thereof, the only defeat he had known, would be over when she faded from his view this time. Even such memories had their own queer, aching value. She too was looking back. Suddenly she lifted her gloved hand. Her lips smiled faintly. Her dark eyes seemed to speak. It was the turn of Soames to make no answer to that smile and that little farewell wave. He went out into the fashionable street, quivering from head to foot. He knew what she had meant to say. "Now that I am going for ever out of the reach of you and yours, forgive me. I wish you well." That was the meaning. Last sign of that terrible reality. Passing morality, duty, common sense, her aversion from him who had owned her body, but had never touched her spirit or her heart. It hurt. Yes, more than if she had kept her mask unmoved, her hand unlifted. 3 days later, in that fast yellowing October, Soames took a taxicab to Highgate Cemetery, and mounted through its white forest to the Forsyte vault. Close to the cedar, above catacombs and columbaria, tall, ugly, and individual, it looked like an apex of the competitive system. He could remember a discussion wherein Swithin had advocated the addition to its face of the pheasant proper. The proposal had been rejected in favour of a wreath in stone above the stark words, "The family vault of Jolyon Forsyte, 1850." It was in good order. All trace of the recent interment had been removed, and its sober grey gloomed reposefully in the sunshine. The whole family lay there now, except old Jolyon's wife, who had gone back under a contract to her own family vault in Suffolk. Old Jolyon himself lying at Robin Hill, and Susan Hayman, cremated, so that none knew where she might be. Soames gazed at it with satisfaction. Massive, needing little attention. And this was important, for he was well aware that no one would attend to it when he himself was gone, and he would have to be looking out for lodgings soon. He might have 20 years before him, but one never knew. 20 years without an aunt or uncle, with a wife of whom one had better not know anything, with a daughter gone from home. His mood inclined to melancholy and retrospection. This cemetery was full, they said, of people with extraordinary names buried in extraordinary taste. Still, they had a fine view up here, right over London. Annette had once given him a story to read by that Frenchman, Maupassant, most lugubrious concern, where all the skeletons emerged from their graves one night, and all the pious inscriptions on the stones were altered to descriptions of their sins. Not a true story at all. He didn't know about the French, but there was not much real harm in English people except their teeth and their taste, which was certainly deplorable. The family vault of Jolyon Forsyte, 1850. A lot of people had been buried here since then. A lot of English life crumbled to mould and dust. The boom of an airplane passing under the gold-tinted clouds caused him to lift his eyes. The deuce of a lot of expansion had gone on. But it all came back to a cemetery, to a name and a date on a tomb. And he thought, with a curious pride, that he and his family had done little or nothing to help this feverish expansion. Good, solid middlemen, they had gone to work with dignity to manage and possess. Superior Dorset, indeed, had built in a dreadful and Jolyon painted in a doubtful period, but so far as he remembered, not another of them all had soiled his hands by creating anything, unless you counted Val Darty and his horse-breeding. Collectors, solicitors, barristers, merchants, publishers, accountants, directors, land agents, even soldiers, there they had been. The country had expanded, as it were, in spite of them. They had checked, controlled, defended, and taken advantage of the process. And when you considered how Superior Dorset had begun life with next to nothing, and his lineal descendants already owned what old Gradman estimated at between £1 million and £1.5 million. It was not so bad. And yet he sometimes felt as if the family bolt was shot, their possessive instinct dying out. They seemed unable to make money, this fourth generation. They were going into art, literature, farming, or the army, or just living on what was left them. They had no push and no tenacity. They would die out if they didn't care. Soames turned from the vault and faced toward the breeze. The air up here would be delicious, if only he could rid his nerves of the feeling that mortality was in it. He gazed restlessly at the crosses and the urns, the angels, the immortelles, the flowers, gaudy or withering, and suddenly he noticed a spot which seemed so different from anything else up there that he was obliged to walk the few necessary yards and look at it. A sober corner, with a massive queer-shaped cross of grey, rough-hewn granite, guarded by 4 dark yew trees. The spot was free from the pressure of the other graves, having a little box-hedged garden on the far side, and in front a goldening birch tree. This oasis in the desert of conventional graves appealed to the aesthetic sense of Soames, and he sat down there in the sunshine. Through those trembling gold birch leaves he gazed out at London, and yielded to the waves of memory. He thought of Irene in Montpellier Square, when her hair was rusty golden, and her white shoulders his. Irene, the prize of his love-passion, resistant to his ownership. He saw Bosinney's body lying in that white mortuary, and Irene sitting on the sofa looking at space with the eyes of a dying bird. Again he thought of her, by the little green niobe in the Bois de Boulogne, once more rejecting him. His fancy took him on, beside his drifting river, on the November day when Fleur was to be born, took him to the dead leaves floating on the green-tinged water, and the snake-headed weed forever swaying and nosing, sinuous, blind, tethered, and on again to the window open to the cold, starry night above Hyde Park, with his father lying dead. His fancy darted to that picture of the future town, to that boy's and Fleur's first meeting, to the bluish trail of Prosper Profond's cigar, and Fleur in the window pointing down to where the fellow prowled, to the sight of Irene and that dead fellow sitting side by side in the stand at Lord's, to her and that boy at Robin Hill, to the sofa where Fleur lay crushed up in the corner, to her lips pressed into his cheek, and her farewell, "Daddy." And suddenly he saw again Irene's grey gloved hand waving its last gesture of release. He sat there a long time, dreaming his career, faithful to the scut of his possessive instinct, warming himself even with its failures. To let, the Forsyte age and way of life, when a man owned his soul, his investments, and his woman, without check or question. And now the state had, or would have, his investments, his woman had herself, and God knew who had his soul. To let, that sane and simple creed. The waters of change were foaming in, carrying the promise of new forms only when their destructive flood should have passed its full. He sat there, subconscious of them, but with his thoughts resolutely set on the past, as a man might ride into a wild night with his face to the tail of his galloping horse. Athwart the Victorian dykes the waters were rolling on property, manners, and morals, on melody and the old forms of art, waters bringing to his mouth a salt taste as of blood, lapping to the foot of this Highgate Hill, where Victorianism lay buried. And sitting there, high up on its most individual spot, Soames, like a figure of investment, refused their restless sounds. Instinctively he would not fight them. There was in him too much primeval wisdom of man the possessive animal. They would quiet down when they had fulfilled their tidal fever of dispossessing and destroying, when the creations and the properties of others were sufficiently broken and defected. They would lapse and ebb, and fresh forms would rise, based on an instinct older than the fever of change, the instinct of home. "Je m'en fiche," said Prosper Profond. Soames did not say "Je m'en fiche." It was French, and the fellow was a thorn in his side. But deep down he knew that change was only the interval of death between two forms of life, destruction necessary to make room for fresher property. What though the ball was up and cosiness to let? Someone would come along and take it again some day. And only one thing really troubled him, sitting there, the melancholy craving in his heart, because the sun was like enchantment on his face, and on the clouds, and on the golden birch leaves, and the wind's rustle was so gentle, and the yew tree green so dark, and the sickle of a moon pale in the sky. He might wish and never get it, the beauty and the loving in the world. End of Part 3, Chapter 11, and of the book To Let. Recording by Simon Evers.